The proper place you start any education is with yourself, and in particular, your consciousness. It is the only place that we can guarantee we both have in common and can both validate as true with absolute certainty. You exist. You know you exist, and I know you exist. I want you to focus your mind on the fact that you are conscious of your existence and throw everything else away. Take a moment and pay attention to this simple fact. You can observe that you exist. Our approach is to use first-hand observation to prove the premise being discussed. I will guide you ever so carefully from one observation to the next, starting from only two first principles: that you exist and that you exist in this universe. From that point forward, we work off the assumption that everything is new and unknown to avoid any potentially corrupt ideas that would interfere with the train of thought I am trying to instill in you. Everything that we observe can be related back to yourself. We will arrive at the subject of observation by thinking clearly. When we have validated it as true, it will become a premise upon which we can consider further observations. We will create a logical chain of true observations step by step to guide your mind along truthful paths. A validation means that you are able to firsthand experience or otherwise observe the premise. When you bring your consciousness to bear on an experience, you will automatically process it for data because there are laws that affect even how your thought processes work. I will show you how to validate each premise as we go, but the ultimate proof is in your direct experience of the subject under discussion. Now, I want you to bring your mind back to the fact that you exist. This is the only fact under consideration right now. What are you? Human? No, we have not established that there are humans. I am talking about your internal conscious mind. Perhaps you do not know. What do you know about your mind that can help you answer the question? It observes things, and you just observed that you can observe. Let us take a closer look at that. The question now is, what kind of things do we observe? The observation that we can observe is not something that we can see. However, there are things that we can see. It would be prudent to take stock of all the things that we can observe. Let us try and enumerate. Sight. Some of our observations are because we see with our eyes. Sound. Other observations are a result of hearing. Taste. Still, other observations are how things taste. Perhaps something we observe tastes sweet or sour, though perhaps experience is a better term. Smell. Some observations or experiences are based on scent. Touch. We observe that we can touch some things and that we can feel the touch as well when other things touch us. Feeling. Observe that we can feel things and have emotions too. Desire. Observe that you wanted to watch this video for some reason. That is the kind of mental attention we seek to work with. Conscience. Observe that you have a conscience. What is that? Reason. Observe that the processes of working out what your conscience was is a way of thinking that we call reason. Thoughts. There are things in our mind called thoughts. What are they and how do they work? Chatter. Ever notice that your mind chatters all day long? What is that? Identity. Observe that you are unique in this universe. Witness. This is the part of us that observed that we can observe. Ultimately, all of our experiences are witnessed by our consciousness somehow. Personality. Also observe that you somehow have an ability to express your unique identity in a certain characteristic manner. State. Our minds can also operate in certain states or modes. Some of these would be altered consciousness states, such as when one takes hallucinogenic drugs. Others relate to its normal operation with respect to its environment, the quality of which is variable. Think order versus chaos and imaginations versus dreams. Do not assume this is an exhaustive list, though it was large. Can you think of other kinds of experiences that can be observed by your mind? Telepathy, maybe one day? The analogy that the mind is a theater is appropriate. In that scenario, our list becomes its setting and cast of characters. Still, it is a large cast, and to one who does not know their own mind, to grapple with it all at once can be confusing. Let us introduce a simple categorization to bring a little bit of order to this chaos. One of the most prominent sources of information for our minds is sensory data. That is, what we see, hear, taste, smell, and touch. Our senses report what occurs outside our minds in the real world. They report the status of physical objects in the environment, including their location, color, and other attributes. We can classify some of the things our minds observe by whether that information comes through via sense. Then our list becomes a table. We have two columns, a sense and a non-sense column. In the sense column, we have sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch. And everything else goes in the non-sense column, which contains feeling, desire, conscience, reason, thoughts, chatter, identity, witness, personality, and state. If the things our minds observe in the sense category occur outside the mind, then it must be that what remains occurs inside the mind. You will note that none of the things in the nonsense category can be seen, heard, tasted, or smelt. In fact, this division into sense and nonsense categories helps to bring about a special kind of clarity about the things our minds can observe. The things in the sense category are physical, objective, universal, and their reporting to our mind is via sense. The things in the nonsense category have exactly the opposite characteristics. They are not physical, they are subjective, they are unique to you, and the reporting to your mind is by means other than sense. The two categories, sense and nonsense, are literal opposites of each other. The law of opposites states that everything has an opposite. One of the most important laws to observe in our reality is that everything has an opposite. It is called a law because it is a foundational rule by which this reality is constructed. Our categorization into sense and nonsense could not help but follow this law. We started by only working on the sense category. Necessarily, we also created the nonsense category by its very nature of being the opposite. It is impossible not to have created the nonsense category. The attributes of sense and nonsense categories are also opposed, signifying that we have made an observation that is crucial to how this reality is constructed. Notice how many physical characteristics have an opposite: cold and hot, attraction and repulsion, fast and slow. Many subjective experiences also have an opposite: happy and sad, love and hate, pleasure and pain, etc. Our sense categorization is also a different kind of opposite, a mental opposite, which includes concepts like true and false and legal and illegal. The oppositeness of such things is a pattern, and because it is a law, its pattern shows up in everything, including in combination with other patterns. Our minds are in this reality just as much as our bodies, and the law applies to everything, mind and body both. The law of opposites is one of the easiest laws to observe and detect, and we will use it significantly. We can further subdivide the sense category based on various physical characteristics, such as elements like fire, water, earth, etc., or environment, land, water, air, space, etc., or other arbitrary categorizations. But that is not the focus of this video, and we will make no further investigation into sense-based observations. The nonsense category, however, we will investigate further. This section of our list is still quite large and abstract, and we need to be more precise in where exactly we focus our minds, but we cannot do that at this level of detail. We must subdivide this section of our list into further categories to get a sharper focus. Let us consider only the nonsense category we developed. It is too broad a category for our mind to observe and understand effectively. What do I mean when I say conscience or desire? How do they work, and is there a relation between them? It can be difficult to address these concerns when all we have established so far is that they, whatever they are not picked up by our senses. So we will create a new level of detail by subdividing this category. To help us determine what these subdivisions ought to be, let us consider a working example for this section and the next. For our working example, Jane is watching a movie in her living room when she suddenly feels hungry. She considers her food options: apple, chips, or steak, and chooses the apple. She goes to the kitchen, grabs the apple, and returns to the living room to eat while watching her movie. The starting state in this example is that Jane is watching a movie. If nothing happened that would alter that state, Jane would watch the movie from start to end, and our example would be very boring. However, something did happen. She felt hungry. This is a change of state in her being that will set in motion a process that we can follow, observe, and learn from if we are very careful and precise. This initial change of state was started by feeling hungry. The hungry part is irrelevant and is merely the content of our example. What is interesting is the feeling itself, and specifically the notion that we can feel at all. This makes it a good candidate for our first subdivision. Jane considers her food options once she is hungry, so automatically she has begun to think once prompted by her feeling, but this analysis is too fast. Stop and ask yourself, why is she considering her food options? To satisfy her hunger. What is satisfy? It means to fulfill a desire. The desire in this case is to satisfy her hunger, which she does by eating something, or said shortly, she had a desire to eat. This desire was hidden in our example, but it is implicitly there based on the feeling of hunger and the need to satisfy it. The feeling and its corresponding desire are implicitly linked together. It is therefore logical to put feeling and desire into one of these categorical subdivisions. We will call this first category psychic because it is concerned with how and why we feel and what we want to do about it. It contains our feelings, emotions, wants, and desires. So now our table has 3 columns: a physical column, a psychic column, and the nonsense column. In the psychic column, we now have feeling and desire, and the nonsense column contains everything else. Now we can proceed with analyzing the next sentence. She considers her food options: apple, chips, or steak, and chooses the apple. Jane has a choice to make and has to think about it. Why did she choose the apple? Try to work it out on your own for a moment, why she would choose that over the chips or the steak. Observe how your thinking works as you do this. Perhaps Jane wants to eat healthy. This eliminates the chips. Is eating a steak in the living room a good idea, especially in the middle of a movie? No, it would take a while to prepare it and it would be messy. Notice firstly that she has options: apple, chips, and steak, and then notice that each were considered in its turn before a decision was made. For each option, a reason was attached along with a decision. If we were to table it, it might look like the following: a table with three columns: option, decision, and reason. In the option column, we have apple, chips, and steak. The decision was yes for the apple, and the reason was because it was healthy. The decision was no for the chips, and the reason was because it is junk food. The decision was no for the steak, and the reason was because it's messy and excessive cooking time. Each option was run through a process that gave her a reason to decide for or against. We do not know what that process is, but we do know that reasons are its output. That a decision was attached would indicate that such an outcome is tightly linked with reasoning. This brings us to choice. There are 8 choices that can be made in this scenario. These 8 are arrived at by considering all possible combinations with possible decisions. The choices are: eat nothing, eat an apple, eat the chips, eat the steak, eat the apple and chips, eat the apple and steak, eat chips and steak, eat everything. Which choice is the right one? Which does she want? Which does she feel like? Which is appropriate for the living room? You will know you have the right choice because it will feel right. And more importantly, wrong choices will feel wrong. We call this ability to feel right and wrong a conscience. When Jane decided that the apple was the right choice and all other choices were wrong, she was working with her conscience in combination with her reasoning. So there seems to be a relation between reasoning and conscience that is tightly linked. Observe one more thing: that reasoning and conscience were working with options. These options are like proto thoughts. They are not full thoughts, that they can become one if they are accepted. All of these things, conscience, reason, and thoughts, have to do with how we think, and they seem to be tightly linked. Let us assemble them into their own category, which we will call mental, because it is concerned with actual thinking and mental activity. Now our table has 4 columns: physical, psychic, mental, and nonsense. In the physical column, we have sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch. In the psychic column, we have feeling and desire. In the mental column, we have conscience, reason, and thoughts. And in the final nonsense column, we have chatter, identity, witness, personality, and state. The next sentence in our working example is: she goes to the kitchen, grabs the apple, and returns to the living room to eat while watching her movie. Having made the decision, now comes action. Action is not something we think about, it is something we do with our bodies. Action is primarily a physical concern, but it cannot happen without us being present in our bodies to drive them. While we carry out the action, we also experience it and witness everything that is happening. We see the kitchen, locate the apple on the counter, smell it to make sure it is healthy, and taste it to make sure it is good. We need to have enough awareness of our surroundings so as not to bump into anything while also navigating the house. Witnessing is the term given to the final delivery of information to your consciousness. Usually, that information delivery is by sense, but it can also be by thinking, feeling, and other means. Witnessing is a state of knowing. Something happened and you saw and heard it. You witnessed it. You can report when, how, what, colors, sounds, smells, what you were doing, what you were thinking, and much more. It is tied in with memory, which is really just knowledge recall. Consider also that it is your memory and your witnessing that we are working with. Anything that has to do with you is going to concern your identity. Identity is the thing that makes you unique amongst all the other consciousnesses out there. When we reference somebody such as you or Jane in our example, we are referencing attributes of their identity. With this identity, we acquire knowledge by witnessing, which is done by thinking, feeling, and sensing. Identity, in and of itself, does not actually do anything. An analogy in everyday life is that it is like an account number. It identifies the account, but there is a lot more going on. That account, for example, has a purpose. It carries out an activity in a certain way, and it does things in that way and not some other way. A power account works on the house's power and not its water. This way is an expression of its purpose. A more developed set of expressions is a personality. Put another way, we could say that the power account has a personality to manage a power supply, just like a water account has a personality to manage one's water intake. The expression is more fitting of humans who express themselves in all kinds of ways. These expressions are unique to individual humans, although they can be copied. People have unique personalities. This goes hand in hand with their identity, for personality is the expression of that unique identity. In our example, Jane would express her personality by walking a certain way, talking a certain way, wearing certain clothing, styling her hair a certain way, decorating her house a certain way, and even the route she chose to go to the kitchen and back. Personality and identity are implicit in everything we do, so they are not often discussed, but they are tightly linked, and this is relevant to our final category. The last category is called Noetic. It has to do with knowledge and the ultimate receipt and delivery of that knowledge via identity and personality. Witnessing, memory, and intuition are ways of working with information in this category. Our table is now complete with 4 columns. In the physical column, we have sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, and chatter. In the psychic column, we have feeling and desire. In the mental column, we have conscience, reason, and thoughts. In the noetic column, identity, witness, and personality. This leaves chatter and state from our original list. Chatter is the internal voice of your objective mind. The objective mind is the interface between the psychic and physical categories of your being and is responsible for operating the body. Chatter is therefore a physical characteristic. State is more concerned with the operation of all the parts of our being. Are they operating correctly or not? When our minds are in one state, we have a certain kind of experience, such as normal life. When they are in another state, we have a different kind of experience, such as dreams. This is due to our senses delivering different information and our actions taking place in a different context. Since state is more concerned with how parts of our being are working together and is not an actual part in and of itself, it has no place in our categories. When I reference state, I refer to the systemic operation of our being as a whole. All of the experiences our minds observe can be divided into 2 broad categories: sense and nonsense. The sense category picks up physical experience. The nonsense category can be further subdivided based on type of thinking: psychic, mental, and noetic. Each non physical category contains its own kinds of experience. To better understand these kinds of experience, let us drill down even further into these categories. We now turn our attention to the content of the categories we have discovered. Our goal is to construct a map of the inner workings of our being. There is a field of knowledge called systems science that can assist us with this goal. And before proceeding further, we ought to briefly understand the technique we are using. In systems science, everything is a system. A system is a bounded whole made up of interacting parts. These parts relate to each other in an integral way that differs from things outside the system. These parts can themselves be systems, making them subsystems, which introduces a form of recursion to systemic operation. For example, consider the radio as a system. At the topmost level of study, it is just a radio and a whole system. We can drill down and discover its parts: speakers, volume control, antenna, frequency finder, CD tray, case, power source, and electronic chip. Each of these parts are also a system, and we could further drill down to discover how each are built, but it is unnecessary to do so a lot of times. The use of a part in a system without knowing its construction is called black boxing. It is enough for us to know that the main parts of the radio are related to each other in some way. If we turn on the radio and pick the right radio station and volume setting, then music will play out the speaker. The speaker interacts with its system in a certain way. It interacts with the outside world in a different way. This difference in interaction, including material construction, is where we find a system boundary. When parts of a system interact with each other, there is often some form of communication. We say that one part delivers a message to another part. If the message contains new data, that data is called information. You are a system. At the topmost level, you are a conscious human being. One of the parts of that system is your body, and another part is your mind. We drilled down the mind and discovered three major parts that we called our categories: psychic, mental, and noetic. We will now drill down further into these categories and use the black boxing technique to define some abstract parts to help us build our map. It must be understood that these are not actual physical parts we are defining. They are conceptualizations that help us focus our mind on certain areas of our being. Your body is a part of the system that is you. It is made up of parts such as the heart, lungs, brain, liver, intestines, nerves, blood, fat, skin, hands, feet, bones, etc. Your body's system has been studied extensively by biologists and is the means by which you interact with the physical universe. Let us return to the radio example and consider its interaction with your body. The radio and the body are each their own system, although there is communication between them from the radio to the body. When you look at a radio, you are using your eyes, a body part, to receive information about it. It is a gray, silver, and black radio, which are characteristics of its case, which is a part. The eyes receive information via light waves, the communication that they understand. The visual image of the radio is the message from the case to the eyes along that communication channel. If this is your first time seeing the radio, this will be new information. If you have seen the radio many times, the messages are still received, but no information is processed. When the radio plays music, sound waves deliver musical messages from the radio speaker to your ears. The radio has a part, the speaker, that can issue the message. Your body has a part, the ear, that can receive the message. It is not important to know how a part is constructed. That the case, eye, speaker, and ear in our example exist is sufficient. What is important are the messages between them. We can deduce the part of the case and the eye by tracing the path of the light wave. If your body can understand light waves, then there must be a part in it that can receive those messages. If the radio can emit light waves, then it must have a part that can emit them. Similarly, if the radio issues sound waves, then it must have a part that can emit sound waves. And if our body can receive sound waves, then it must have a part that can receive sound waves. This logic of deducing that a part seemingly exists based on messages in or out is the technique that system science enables us to use to better understand our mind. So we now turn our attention to the categories and investigate the example in the previous section, again, with the aim to look for messages via which we can derive system parts. Recall the first sentence of our working example. Jane is watching a movie in her living room when she suddenly feels hungry. We already recognized that she can feel and that this particular feeling is of hunger. Where does hunger originate? The feeling of hunger originates from the stomach. The stomach is a part of the body, so this forms one end of a communication channel. In fact, this end is on the objective side, but the receiving end is on the subjective side in the psychic area of our being. We do not know what that part is, but using our system science logic, we know that there must be a part that can receive feelings. We call this part feeling. Hunger is a message. In fact, all the different types of feelings are messages: anger, joy, sadness, pain, pleasure, and so forth. Each feeling may originate from a different source in the objective world, but they all come to the part of us that can feel. Each feeling can convey with it information that we can work with. Note the labeled white circles in the graphic. These are the parts in each category. Feeling is drawn on the left side because it has a primarily receiving function. Parts with such receiving function are essentially passive in their nature and act only when a message comes to them. Next, we established that Jane had a desire to eat something as a direct result of feeling hungry. So now the communication channel shifts from feeling to a part that can receive desirous messages. This brings to mind our ability to act on impulse. Separating the action out, what is an impulse but a response to a feeling? It is a want or a desire or a goal, and then we have the ability to act on it with our body. It is the emission of a directive from a part of our being to our body. This directive we call desire, and it is from a part which we will call desire. Desires are messages from the part of us that desires, and these messages contain instruction for action or a goal to be met or pursued. Some desires are for food, fame, wealth, power, and sex. Desires always eventually go to our body, and they require that we work with it to obtain them. Desires require effort, and this characteristic makes them an active part of our being, whereas feelings are passive. Active parts are drawn on the right side of the opening graphic. Active parts generally do not do anything until your attention is focused on the function, and then they come into operation. The second sentence in our working example concerns the mental category. She considers her food options: apples, chips, or steak, and chooses the apple. Each of these options is a message from the part of us that desires. These types of messages are considerations. They will ask questions such as, should I, what if, or how? Thus far, Jane knows that she is hungry and desires to eat something. Now she asks, should I eat an apple? There must be a part that can receive and understand this question. That part we call reason. It takes in considerations from our desire part and works out why, how, and other logistical tasks. It may, for example, plot the route to the kitchen and consider if a pit stop to the bathroom is necessary, should such feelings and desires also be in play. In our example, it will consider what is involved in acquiring each of the food choices of apple, chips, or steak. It will then attach a reason to our desire and send that off to another part for consideration. Reason is active because it does logistical work when asked, and this takes effort. This is the part that we engage when we think things through and try to come up with logical and rational means to attain answers, goals, or desires. The part that considers the reasons issued is the part that knows right from wrong, called rightness. In our working example, it came out to be that the apple was the right thing to eat because it was healthy. Jane wants to eat healthy. Rightness will issue another message back to feeling to indicate whether the given reason is right or not. If we say that something feels right or feels wrong, we are referring to this process. What is termed conscience isn't actually a part, really. It is a message from the part of us that knows right from wrong to the part of us that feels. This is why that which is right or wrong has a feeling aspect to it. Rightness is passive. Whenever it is given a reason, it will tell you whether it is right or not. This begs the question, what is right and how does it know that? I cannot say that we really know, although a fundamental assumption is that it only warns if an action will cause harm to another. In thinking in destiny, this area is a part of our thinker, which is a deep subconscious area of our being. The subject of our working example is Jane and her hunger. We saw how hunger related to the part of her or our being that feels. But who is feeling? Jane is, or perhaps you are right now. In our example, that Jane was feeling hungry and not somebody else is something that we can work with. It is identity that receives the feelings subject to the constraint that nothing else receives those feelings. Identity is the part of us that defines our uniqueness. Without it, we cannot exist, for it is the foundation upon which a conscious being is built. If, for example, you held a raindrop in your hand, you would know that whatever you do with it will be in reference to that raindrop and not some other raindrop. But if you were to drop that raindrop into an ocean, then you would not be able to tell it from all the other raindrops in the ocean. The raindrop loses its individuality and does whatever the ocean current wants it to do, along with all the other lost raindrops. That ocean is like consciousness before it has spawned an individuated being, and the anchor that holds that individuality is the part here termed identity. A thing that has no identity is unconscious and dead. If something once had identity and lost it, it will decay, degenerate, and die, as per the laws of nature. If something gains an identity where before it had none, it will become alive, as if life were literally breathed into it. An example of this is when an infant becomes a toddler, who then becomes a talkative child. The infant operates mostly on instinct, which is an unconscious mode of being, but as it gains experience and builds intelligence, it becomes more conscious and develops that identity. The identity is that part of you that ultimately receives all messages, be they feelings, desires, reasons, conscience, or sense. It is sometimes identified as the witness for this passive action. Identity does not do anything other than anchor one's consciousness in reality and witnesses everything. We draw it on the left in our opening diagram because of its passive nature. Identity is related to knowledge because it collects all information processed by our being and stores it. That information is stored in our consciousness, although it is not a physical store. We can access it all at will via our memory. It is because of identity's close relation with knowledge that it is part of the Noetic category. While identity takes in and stores knowledge, the self is the means by which we explore and express that knowledge. This self part might synonymously be described as the personality, but it is a bit more than that. It includes the focal point around which you experience and interact with your reality. Jane is in the living room, the focal point of which is her body. Around her is a television, a couch, and somewhere down the hall is a kitchen with food. Jane expresses herself in a certain way. In this case, it is that she prefers to eat healthily. Healthy eating would be a habit of her personality, which is the expression of herself in this universe. Similarly, while Jane is considering her options for food, Her self interacts internally with her mind. In this situation, the thoughts are arranged around a focal point of, say, conscious light for consideration, which is witnessed by the identity part again. Wherever your consciousness is focused, whether it be in the physical universe, your thinking mind, your dreams, or your imagination, you will experience that reality around a focal point of your being. That focal point is what is meant by self, in particular, working in tandem with its identity to express and interact with it via external or internal means. This expression is what makes the self the active component of the pair, and its purpose is to go out and seek the knowledge that identity ultimately receives. It is proper due diligence to consider two outlying observations from the previous section. One, we observed that mental chatter was a characteristic of what is called our objective mind. Two, it was stated that the objective mind is an interface between the psychic and physical characteristics. This objective mind is drawn as the center mind part in the opening graphic. It is what we actually think about whenever we think about mind. If Jane were mentally talking to herself as she went to prepare an apple, she would be chattering with this part. The instructions she gave to her body to go to the kitchen and prepare that apple also originated from this part after having her desire to eat. The mind is placed on our graphic between the psychic and physical categories because it is an interface between the parts in those categories. This is apropos to the concept of interface as understood in systems science. An interface is a part or a system that facilitates information flow between two systems or a system and the environment. In this case, the two systems are the physical body on the objective side and our subjective being. The mind is implemented in the physical realm by the brain, but operated or inhabited in the subjective realm by our being. It is a lot like a human being using a computer. The human is subjective to the digital environment of the computer, which is the operating system and software program, which is objective. The computer itself is the interface. The mind controls the body, both consciously and unconsciously. So the body is drawn in our opening graphic in the physical category under the mind. It is prudent to now summarize what we have discovered and the technique used for that discovery. This video started with just you, a clear mind, and a goal of understanding yourself. We noted that we have the ability to observe our own experiences if we pay careful attention. We used our senses to gain a better idea of our experiences by categorizing them based on whether they come in from our senses or not. Experiences that we picked up through our senses we called physical and left it at that. Everything else was considered non physical or nonsense, but the category was too broad to get a good mental grip on it, so it was divided further. This further divided category gave us terms such as psychic, mental, and noetic to help focus our minds. There are now four broad categories of experience to work with. The final step involved analysis to break our experiences down into component parts based on the type of message each was working with. These parts were feeling, desire, reason, rightness, identity, self, the objective mind, and the physical body. And we saw briefly that there is a way that the parts interact with each other that warrants further investigation. The technique is 1. Start with you, 2. Divide by sense, 3. Categorize nonsense by type, and 4. Analyze the categories. We have applied this technique internally to come up with a basic map of our subjective being. That is, the part of ourself that is internal to our minds and that we experience most directly. This was good for discovering a little bit about how we work. But what about the reality we find ourselves in? Understanding our environment is just as important as understanding ourselves, for it is the interaction between one and the other that creates growth. Note that we are in this reality as a self. The above map is a complete visual representation of what we have accomplished in this section. It shows you how to guide your mind from nothing along specific pathways so that you can observe each of its major subjective parts. First, you start by clearing your mind, noting just that you exist and that you are observing experiences. Next, you consider whether a given experience is coming through your senses or not. You are now paying a bit more attention to it and using the map to guide you. If the observed experience is coming in through your senses, it is a physical experience and handled by your body, and although we could investigate further, we are not interested in doing so. If the observed experience does not come through your senses, then you need to find out which category it belongs to. Is it psychic, mental, or noetic? Are you feeling it, thinking it, or do you know it? Then finally, you focus on the specific nature of the observed experience. Understand that it is a message to a part of your being, and from that you can infer the part. The mind David Hume is describing is the objective mind. This is the mind we all know and love, the one that chatters away all day long, and the one in which we do our primary thinking. In our map, it is the mind part shown between the psychic and physical categories. This mind functions as the interface between our subjective being and objective body, and it is really, really good at working with objects. A thought is an object in your mind. If your mind was a toolbox, then a thought is an individual tool, and like a tool, each thought serves its own purpose. But thoughts are finicky and flighty, and they do not stay around in your mind for very long. Where do they go? When thoughts are not in your mind, let us say that they still live, but in the mental category. While your mind is physical in its nature, a thought is actually not a physical thing. Your senses cannot detect them, remember. When a thought enters your mind, what happens is that an objective representation of that thought is formed in your mind so that you can apprehend it. This representation dissipates when the thought leaves. Holding a thought in your mind front and center in your attention is what focus does. This is a faculty that requires great strength and stamina to train and operate well. It is a lot like a spotlight in the theater of the mind analogy. Sadly, most humans have underdeveloped focusing capabilities and therefore cannot think well because they cannot hold a single thought in their mind for very long. To help you become conscious of what a thought is really, we're going to start with a study of thought structure. This basic pattern will help you identify and isolate individual thoughts in your mind so you can work with them. Recall the law of opposites, which states that everything has an opposite. This is true of physical things, and it is also true of non physical things, such as feelings and concepts. Our thinking must obey the laws of the universe just like everything else. We cannot think of something without also thinking of its opposite. If we were to take the idea of kindness, for example, we cannot really understand, know, and appreciate what kindness is unless we also know about unkindness. Consider two hypothetical people, Sally and John. Sally has spent her life with everyone being kind to her. John, however, grew up in a very unkind atmosphere. John has more knowledge of unkindness than Sally, while Sally has more knowledge of kindness than John. Sally will not appreciate when someone is being kind to her as often, and John will not care if someone is being unkind to him. They are both used to it and they both know it well. But if somebody is kind to John or unkind to Sally, suddenly the experience will have meaning. John hasn't known kindness and Sally hasn't known unkindness. Now John can appreciate and understand what kindness is really like and strive for it. Sally can also now appreciate unkindness better and know to watch out for those people in the future. We can intuitively appreciate that kindness is better than unkindness by thinking about it. To think of kindness, we are also excluding all the things that are not kind, grouped as unkindness. To think of unkindness, to shine the spotlight of attention on that idea, means to put everything that is kind out of the spotlight and into the shadow. We do this for every pair of opposites when we think. The most basic pattern that makes up our thinking is a pair of opposites. If we were to distill a thought down to its most basic elements, we would find such a pairing: love and hate, hot and cold, pleasure and pain, liberal and conservative, predator and prey, and so forth. These pairings are one thing, a thought. We can say that a thought is made up of two poles, or ends or sides, and those poles are opposed to each other, like a magnet. The polar structure of a thought is a spectrum that allows you to orient your mind anywhere upon it: the center, the left, the right, and so on. In 2017, the gender spectrum is a very prominent idea, with some people pushing it forward and others opposed. When you look at it, you should understand that they are mapping out one thing: the thought of gender, with two opposing poles, masculine and feminine. Sometimes there are multiple dimensions to this, in which case there are multiple thoughts in play. The political spectrum is another prominent idea that affects our lives and can be understood in the same manner. One pole is passive. This pole accepts and allows whatever happens to it without resistance. It can also receive information, and in some cases, it may even establish the general form of the thought. The active pole is the exact opposite of its paired passive pole. It initiates and sends it into the universe. What function the passive and active poles take in particular depends on the character of the thought. What is the thought? It can be anything, but that thing will have both a passive and active aspect to it, and those aspects are representative of the passive and active poles of the thought. One pole typically dominates the other pole. It might be that one thought is primarily passive in its nature, such as a rock, or another thought is primarily active in its nature, such as war. There is a process to balancing thoughts which we call a life cycle. A balanced thought is when both passive and active sides have equal strength, are fully understood, and in effect cancel each other out. The thought has no more purpose, has no more influence on the thinker's life, and no longer needs to exist. The wielder of the thought, much like a craftsman and his tools, has mastery of his thinking on the particular subject matter. Let us study the thought life cycle in more detail to get a better understanding of what is going on here. What you know affects how you think, which affects how you feel, which affects what you do with your body. This statement succinctly summarizes the direction of control of your being. It also matches the first half of the thought life cycle. What I present to you in this section is a simplified version of the real thought life cycle. Percival goes into much more complexity in his book, Thinking and Destiny, and you are highly encouraged to read it to get a better understanding of what we are working with. A thought, like all things in the universe, has elements and behaviors in each of the categories. In order for you to think about something in the universe, you must first draw upon your knowledge of the universe. This noetic operation begins the creation of a thought. Let us consider a thought as a running example in this section. We will work with the thought of all tax collectors are evil. In order to think this thought, we must first have knowledge of what tax collectors are, what evil is, what all is. This first stage in the thought life cycle is our drawing upon information that we already have. We cannot think with information until we have it, say, loaded in our memory banks. That is to say, we must be actively conscious of the information in order to think with it. So we must bring into focus what we already know about tax collectors, that we are talking about all of them, and that they are evil. We think to form a new thought for the purpose of learning something new. It normally works by comparing and arranging thoughts we already know in our minds to try and arrive at a solution. So we compare the preloaded thoughts of tax collectors, evil, and all and arrange them in a way that makes sense for our new thought. All tax collectors are evil. It is a warning to your fellow man, a demonization of tax collectors, an alignment of yourself with good, the opposite of evil, and perhaps even a call to action. Thoughts are inherently biased. You can see the obvious bias in our example. It is so wrong, and you know it. But why do you know it? When you construct a thought, you work with the knowledge that you have acquired up to that point in your life. Arlen Hauser calls this your level. It is a lot like the concept of game levels in video games. Somebody who has a lot more knowledge about a topic, or in general, is at a higher level than somebody who does not. They are thus able to think with and create higher level thoughts in the areas in which they are knowledgeable. This does not mean that their knowledge of the thought is all encompassing. If it were all encompassing, they would not have a bias in the thought, for they would instantly know the other side of the thought and could see the opposing point. Your level of knowledge in your thoughts forms your attachment to the thought. We will discuss attachments in more details later. For now, it is enough to know that this level determines how we feel about the thought. Try to get yourself into the head of somebody who actually thinks all tax collectors are evil. What does that feel like, if you can imagine it? You might agree or you might disagree. If you agree, you will experience a positive emotion such as agreement, affirmation, encouragement, or preference. If you disagree, you will experience a negative emotion such as prejudice or admonishment. These feelings that you experience with respect to the thought indicate your level of the thought. They are what will motivate you to take action should action be necessary. You can think of it as though the thought is first encoded with the knowledge you have, and then your feelings are added to it. From this point forward, every time you think about this thought, you will also feel it in a preferential or prejudicial manner until such time as you release it. The thought will come and go, but it will always come back until it is released. Thoughts manifest themselves in the physical world. What first started out with some starter knowledge has worked into a new thing by thinking. Then, with that new thing, you felt you should do something about it. This is the action stage, also called manifestation or exteriorization. Let's say we meet an actual tax collector and they appear to be an all right human being just doing their job. If you are really paying attention, perhaps you just felt a sigh of relief at where I was taking this example, or maybe it was expectation. That feeling is the opposite of what was felt when the thought was originally formed. This stage in the thought life cycle is when an event occurs in the physical world that is related to the thought and allows those who experience it to learn from it. If events occur that are related to the thought but provide no learning opportunity, those are not the events I am talking about. An example would be if we were to go on the internet and read about evil tax collector stories. This would only serve to reinforce our feelings in the thought, and it may even strengthen our attachment, possibly into extreme territory. This event does provide us an opportunity to learn. We met an actual tax collector, and it was immediately obvious to us that they are a nice, pleasant human being with a sense of humor and are just doing a job to get by. There was no evilness about them. So, what do we do with this information? How do we feel about it? Perhaps we feel disappointed. If tax collectors are not evil, then we cannot go about our plans on them. Or perhaps you think that this tax collector isn't evil, but some others might be, and so you reserve judgment for another time. This latter case is a situation of failing to learn from experience. Should we reserve judgment until later, we will at some point in the future have another event in our lives that presents the opposite of our thought that tax collectors are evil. The universe, let's say, will try to show us in another way that all tax collectors are in fact not evil. Your thinking along this topic will turn into actions that work out in such a way that events occur in your life that coalesce around evil tax collectors so that you have the opportunity to learn from them again. We can literally say that your thinking dictates your destiny. This is a very subtle point, but it is a law of how your thinking works. Now, let's say that we do, in fact, feel disappointed and come to a realization that not all tax collectors are evil. That is detachment. It is not a nice feeling, but it is an important feeling when you are learning. You will now begin to integrate the opposite viewpoint from where you started. In order to learn this lesson, we have to think about it carefully. Every thought has data in it that is useful for us to know and helps us grow. That data is not what we initially think it is. Rather, it is the union of our initial thinking combined with the opposite view into something new and higher. That is the data that we learn when we come to a realization. In order to accomplish this feat, we must first be exposed to the opposite view and then be wise enough to notice what went wrong and learn from it. When we realize that not all tax collectors are evil, what do we think about really when we think about tax collectors, or of evil, or of all? These thoughts can be broken down individually into their thought structures. Every thought has its opposite, so we can at least start there. The passive side of a thought is one that tends not to do anything until it is interacted with. The active side requires effort, requires will. So good is fine letting everybody be as they are, whereas evil is actively malevolent. When we think that a tax collector is evil, we are thinking that they are actively malevolent against us in some way. This is not necessarily true, although it can appear that way to some perspectives. None and all are words that indicate set logic. There is also some, which is anywhere in between. We are applying a kind of mathematical logic to our thinking when we use these words to quantify our subject. The idea of a tax collector might be a little tricky. We start with the opposite and form a complete thought. The opposite of a tax collector is someone who gives tax. We will say a taxpayer. There are a lot of people out there who want respect for taxpayers. Why? What is it about being a taxpayer that requires us to give tax to a tax collector? When you understand how taxpayer and tax collector are not only related but two sides of the same thing, then you can say that you understand this thought well. What is that same thing of which both sides are a part? It might be that our observation is initially correct, but our initial understanding is wrong. Perhaps the entire thought of taxation is evil, or perhaps it is our place in the structure. We cannot truly know unless we were to go into it in excruciating detail. That is what we do at this particular stage in the thought life cycle. We study the thought and all of its components and how they are all related to each other to try to arrive at a higher, more complete, maybe even paradoxical understanding of the thing we were thinking about. This new understanding is added to our knowledge store, or memory bank, or whatever term you prefer to use where all your learned knowledge goes. When it is added to our knowledge store, there is a key difference in our state of being than from when we started. We suddenly have more knowledge in our knowledge store. This is actually an achievement and it should feel satisfying because it means that we have grown and accomplished something. In the course of everyday events, it is comparatively rare because most of the time we do not learn and instead repeat our actions over and over and over again. So when we do finally pay attention, think about it, and learn, then it feels great because we have grown and we know we have grown. This latter knowing is different from the new knowledge added to our knowledge store. This latter knowing is knowledge of ourselves and our state of being, and it is implicit in everything we witness, think, and do at all times. We always know, even if we don't think about it or are even aware of it, the state of our knowledge store. And now we know that it has new information in it. We know we have grown. This is the purpose of a thought, by the way, to learn from it and grow, to grow our beings and to grow our consciousnesses. We use our thoughts, when we think about them, that is, to become more aware of our environment, ourselves, and ultimately our consciousnesses. We are going to go over the thought life cycle again, but this time using Percival's model directly as it appears in Thinking and Destiny. I really want you to understand this concept thoroughly because we will use it later to explore a number of concepts and arguments with formidable consequences. Thoughts have a life cycle, and that cycle repeats until you learn from it. We need to briefly introduce another category in this section to cover that which is not in existence, the unmanifest. This is the realm of potential and of that which is not in the universe. It is the realm of the possible but extremely improbable, the impossible, and the possible that has happened already or is yet to happen. As an example, consider the possibility of beings being wiped out in a plague. Such an event is very, very unlikely, but ever possible, and so it is categorized as unmanifest until such time as its probability becomes certain, if ever. Another example is that of humans shapeshifting into dinosaurs, which is impossible, and so stays forever in the unmanifest category. There are no parts in this category, and in fact, we are not dealing with parts in the thought life cycle. We are dealing with stages of a process. The solid white circles in the diagrams represent those stages of the process that interact with the parts of your subjective being that we identified earlier. So, breath works with your identity. This is happening to you. Aim works with your conscience to aim your mind rightfully. Form works with your feelings and imagination to motivate you to bring life to your idea. Manifestation happens with your body. Then comes the balancing, post experience, based on your desires. Then, if you are thinking, you can resolve the thought reasonably. Then you gain knowledge and advance your character. The rest is potential and recognition of patterns and incorporation into future potential, all contained within your consciousness. We now explore each of these stages in detail. Firstly, recall the void and clear your mind. Notice that there are no thoughts in your mind right now, ideally. You are conscious of your mind, but there is no thought. Now, think about this video. To create your thought of this video, you had to transfer some of your consciousness to that thought to give it an identity. The thought is about this video in particular and not some other thing. That is the first step in the thought life cycle. Attach consciousness. It is at the top center of the thought diagram. Now, I want to remind you that you are present and conscious in the void of your mind. You have access to knowledge about this video and many other things, but are not presently working with that knowledge. Since you will think about this video, you will move upon all that knowledge and draw into focus or center stage of your mind what you know about this video. This is the second step of the thought life cycle, motion. We gave the thought an identity, this video, via consciousness, and then moved in such a way as to accumulate data in the thought. The third step is substance. This occurs when all that you know about this video has been incorporated into the thought of this video. We have stopped moving and drawing upon our knowledge of the video. In the computer world, this would be a lot like moving data from a hard drive into memory where it can be accessed quickly. When we say that an idea has substance, we mean that it has a lot of knowledge behind it, and this typically also means that the speaker knows what they are talking about. Now we begin to perform noetic and mental operations to construct the thought. Here is where we really begin to think. What is the video we are talking about? Why am I watching it? What do I hope to get out of it? Will others find it useful? Do I like the video? Is it helpful? What exactly are you thinking about the video? Is there something you would like to do with the video? All of these questions that enter your mind when you think about this video are part of the noetic and mental operations that construct the thought. That these particular questions occur and not others, as well as all of the data that gives the thought its substance, all of this is dependent upon what we know of the video, of the environment, of our motivations, and of so much more. There is a limit to how we are able to think, which is bounded by this knowledge. We cannot ask questions to think with if we do not have the data necessary to formulate the question. The breath stage has to do with how your available knowledge influences events in your life that lead to the construction of the thought. It may involve research or it may involve mulling over the subject, as with the questions above. After a while, you will get an idea of where it is you want to take this thought or what it is that you want to do with it. When we begin to grasp what we are thinking about, we will then assign an aim to the thought. This is where you try to answer the earlier questions in accordance with your interests or desires. Perhaps watching this video meets a purpose of some kind that is relevant to you. How this video helps you with that purpose is the aim that you have attached to your thought of this video. An aim is always associated with a desire, and now we get into the psychic section of the thought life cycle. Because the aim is associated with a desire, there is also a corresponding feeling associated with it, for you cannot have a desire without a feeling of some kind. They are two sides of the same thing, just like a thought and its pair of opposites. As you think about what you want to do with this thought along that aim that matches your desires, that feels right, you will formulate a plan of action. The form stage is the gathering of the necessary elements of the universe to manifest a thought on the physical world. The actual publication of this video and your watching it constitute the physical manifestation stage of the thought's life cycle. Percival calls this process exteriorization in his book. Those who watch this video will receive value from it to assist with their aims and desires. This stage in a thought life cycle is the halfway point and is located at the bottom center of our graphic. The first half of the thought life cycle is all about the creation of the thought from what we know through various steps until it manifests as an object, an action, or an event in the physical universe. At this juncture, I want to point out that there is a relation between a thought and a thing. A thing is just the physical manifested object of a thought, and it occurs at that point in its life cycle. A thought is the entire conceptual entity behind the thing and exists at every universal category. A thought has a thing only at one point in its life cycle, the manifestation stage. The key takeaway here is that behind everything is a thought. Behind every object, action, or event is a thought. If we were to focus on just the thoughts and their relation to each other, we can develop a thought tracking ability. As a thought advances in its life cycle, it passes through the universal categories. From the top, there is firstly nothing about the thought that exists in the world or in your mind. It advances into the noetic category to collect the knowledge and establish a substance to it. The thought advances next into the mental category to establish its aim and answer how is it going to be in the physical universe. Then the thought advances into the psychic category to attach to the beings that will bring it forth. The attachment comes with a preferential feeling, which triggers the corresponding desires to bring it forth. So one who is thinking of a hammer will get up and go invent a hammer. The form, what the hammer is supposed to be, is decided in the psychic stage and manifested in the physical stage by the work of the inventor. Now back to our working example of this video. The thought of this video will stay in existence until every last copy of it has been destroyed. This could be thousands of years. For you who watch it, for me who created it, it is enough that we learn what is trying to be communicated in order to advance in our own thoughts life cycle. Your thought of this video is not the same thought as the thought of the video itself. The thought will advance up the second half of its life cycle eventually. This is not immediate and is conditional upon successfully integrating the knowledge from experience of the thought into your being. Let us say that you think this video is ridiculous. Your thought is that what it is trying to teach you is crazy nonsense, not backed by science or the majority and therefore useless. You will reject the things I'm trying to point out in favor of your current attachments. You will continue to live your life according to those attachments, totally ignoring how they work and their effect upon your being. You will continue to be the victim of those who do understand how they work and use them against you, knowingly or unknowingly. At some point in the future, you may tire of such abuse and you will once again arrive at the concept of a thought life cycle, perhaps through this video or through thinking and destiny, perhaps through study of psychology and law, perhaps through study of occultism and spirituality, or perhaps through some other medium. At that point, you will remember this video and what I was trying to tell you, and then it will click. When you encounter the thought physically, there is an opportunity for you to learn from it to incorporate the data that makes up that thought. If you fail to learn from it in that moment, what will happen is that you will continue to live your life as it currently is without the data that was presented to you. The thought will not advance in its life cycle, but instead repeat the physical manifestation stage at a later point in time, although perhaps with a different form. It will continue to do this until you learn from it. This phenomena is noticed on a large scale when people say that history repeats. It is actually given a name: historic recurrence, the repetition of similar events in history. On June 24th, 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte began an invasion of Russia with a force of at least 450,000 to Russia's 200,000. Outnumbered, Russia pulled back and allowed Napoleon to capture Vilna on June 27. In July, the Russians abandoned Vitebsk, and in August they abandoned Smolensk. The Russians burned the military supplies and crops as they left to deny French fortifications. In September, they fought in Borodino, with the Russians retreating to Moscow, and on September 14th, the French had taken Moscow too. By this point, Napoleon's army was down to 100,000. There was little food and snow was already falling, so on October 19, Napoleon retreated, knowing he and his army would not survive the winter. The Russians regrouped and forced the French back the way they came. They fought at Malyaroslavetsk and again at Smolensk, and at both places there was no food available because it was already consumed during the invasion. Early winter came with its sub-zero temperatures and lots of snow and killed thousands of French soldiers on particularly bad nights. In late November, Napoleon's force narrowly escaped annihilation crossing the Berezina River, and on December 14, the remainder finally left Russia, defeated, hungry, and cold. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler began an invasion of Russia with a force of 3 million elite soldiers. His front covered 2,000 miles from the North Cape to the Black Sea. They took Minsk and Smolensk easily and advanced towards Leningrad and Moscow. Freshly resupplied in September, the Germans took Kiev and Bryansk-Vyazma in October. Meanwhile, Russian counterattacks slowed their advance towards Moscow. With heavy rain and November frost, the Germans persisted to Moscow despite no winter supplies. The Russians stopped them in December and forced their retreat and nearly encircled their army. This resulted in a two-front war for Germany, which they could not win. This is one of the most common examples cited when researching historic recurrence. Napoleon invades Russia in the winter and fails. Hitler invades Russia in the winter and fails. The obvious lesson is do not invade Russia in the winter. But more importantly, the knowledge of how to fight in winter was lacking in both cases for the French and the Germans. The Russians knew how to fight in winter because it is their home climate. The Germans had an opportunity to learn from France's mistake, but failed to do so, and so they too learned a hard lesson about fighting in unfamiliar climates. The phenomena of historic recurrence also applies individually. Let's say a child is picked on by all the bullies in school. They are picked on relentlessly year after year, school after school. What is not known to the child is that they are a magnet for the bullies, attracting the bullies to themselves by giving off signals of weakness. The bullies cannot stand this, for it reminds them of themselves in their situation with their parents, so they take their anger out on the child. Both the child and the bully are victims of the same thing, abuse, but express it with opposing polarities, the child being introverted and the bully extroverted. Both of them need to learn how to stand up for themselves in their respective situations. Unless and until they do, they will forever be a victim and a bully. In the Wikipedia article on historic recurrence is a quote by Niccolo Machiavelli. When states have arrived at their greatest perfection, they soon begin to decline. In the same manner, having been reduced by disorder and sunk to their utmost state of depression, unable to descend lower, they, of necessity, reascend, and thus from good they gradually decline to evil, and from evil mount up to good. He further states that valor and political effectiveness produce peace, and that peace brings idleness, idleness brings disorder, and disorder brings ruin. Then, from ruin springs order, and from order comes valor and political effectiveness, and from this glory and good fortunes. Along the same lines of thinking is the more modern quote by G. Michael Hopf. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times. Notice the oscillation between opposites. In Machiavelli's quote, we have an oscillation between perfection and decline, order and disorder, good and evil. Machiavelli also notes oscillations between opposites of valor and ruin, peace and disorder, idleness and effectiveness. Hopf makes the same observations between hard times and good times, and strong men and weak men. Each of these pair of opposites is an individual thought being experienced and learned by people in their time and in their circumstance. By studying their circumstance and recognizing the pattern, we can also learn what they learned without having to experience what they experienced. If, during good times, we learned how not to create weak men, then we could avoid the hard times that will surely follow. But so long as that knowledge is not well known, good times will lead to hard times by the creation of weak men. The thought repeats itself in possibly different forms until the opposite knowledge it has to offer is learned and incorporated. We say history repeats while lessons are unlearned. The structure of a thought dictates that the initial aim that one attached to the thought has a corresponding opposite aim. This opposing aim is called the balancing factor, and it will have the same magnitude of the initial aim in order to bring you back to center. If the balancing factor is not incorporated or learned, the thought stays in existence and history will repeat itself. If the balancing factor is incorporated and the knowledge learned, then the thought proceeds on its life cycle to completion. It will proceed back up the universal categories and return to void, but this time it will focus on the opposite pole of the initial aim with the intention of resolving the two poles back into the one thought. So we start back in the psychic category. Perhaps you enjoy this video or perhaps you hate it. It depends on your initial aim, on what you're hoping to get out of this video. Maybe what I have told you so far has broken your plans. Maybe it has helped. How you feel depends on whether this video meets your objective. In order to resolve the thought, you will need to understand that how you feel now about this video and how you felt before watching it are the same thing. Try to get at the paradox of how two opposing things can possibly be the same thing. This is the key to resolving a thought, but it requires information you do not have, which is also why it is a paradox. It can be a difficult challenge to resolve a thought, and many of them go unnoticed for a long time. It requires clarity of thought. You must think well and skillfully, a mental action, and you must look at the thought from a higher dimension. That going above is how you solve the paradox. Knowledge of the patterns of the thought's behavior is useful, but it is not the knowledge of the thought itself. For example, hot and cold are the same thing. If that sounds crazy, then you have just encountered the paradox. You need to put aside your feelings on the subject, find the missing information that explains how they are the same thing, and incorporate that knowledge into your being. Own it, master it. It is yours. In this case, science has discovered that temperature is the result of the movement of molecules. Faster moving molecules relate to a hotter object, while slower moving molecules make it colder. Every thought ends with recognizing this sameness and incorporating it into your being. It is how you grow. When this stage of a thought's life cycle is reached, you have successfully learned the knowledge the thought had to offer. Your attachment to the thought will be released and it will no longer affect you. From this point forward, you know it, and you know it well. The knowledge is there for you to use whenever you want. It is incorporated into your intelligence and available to your consciousness whenever you will it. These are the final operations for the thought after which it no longer has any need to exist and leaves the universe. The thought leaves you better than how it came to you. The addition of this knowledge to your being is akin to increasing the size of your consciousness. You become a bigger, better, and stronger version of yourself. The data the thought imparts on you is abstract. It has no physical form or representation. You simply know it and can use it whenever you will at the speed of instant. Thoughts go out into reality to explore it so you can learn from it, and then they come back to you before they dissipate. Thoughts are the deliberate tools of your mind, and the conscious, deliberate, and skillful use of a tool is what makes a master. It is prudent to spend a bit more time going over the concept of attachment because it is vital to how a thought works and how it influences you. There is more to attachments than is initially apparent. In this part, we will look at how attachments work, what preference and prejudice are, what perspective is, what progression is, how magnitude influences attachments, and finally, extremism. The diagram shows the thought structure with a man on one side to illustrate an attachment to that side of the thought. In order to think with this thought, he had to attach himself to it in order to set its aim. He had to want or desire something and set about how to get it. In working out that problem, he attached himself to the thought. This is the basis for belief and ideologies. He had to work it out for his desire, and in the process, did not work it out for the opposite desire. In fact, it may even be deliberate that what he is working for is to subdue the opposite side of the thought. Consider the thought of good and evil. Most people are firmly attached to the idea of doing good. They think in their minds to only do good, perhaps in order to subdue evil. Some of their actions in relation to this thought might be giving to charity or the homeless, or helping those in need, or bringing in refugees who need a place to live safely. One who is not attached to a thought will not care for the outcome either way. Any action, whether good or evil in our example, is the way it is, and they will adapt accordingly. If someone wants to give to charity out of a sense of duty, more power to them. If someone wants to fight priests out of a sense of duty, more power to them. Notice how you felt about those last two statements. That's preference and prejudice. Preference is when your attachment to a thought aligns with what is being expressed. The good statement, giving to charity, is typically preferential for those who believe in good. Prejudice is when your attachment to a thought is opposed to what is being expressed. It is the exact opposite of preference. The evil statement, fighting priests, is typically prejudicial for those who believe in good. Attaching to a thought feels good. This is because when you attach to it, you establish a preference and you are surrounded by that preference. Some people get addicted to this feeling and progress in their attachment towards extremism. The good feeling of things aligning with your preference is how the thought communicates to you that things align. If things did not align, it would feel bad or prejudicial. Detaching from a thought typically feels bad. This is because you have to give up your attachment and all the things you liked about it. You have to face the negative side of it, which you were naturally opposed to. In the process, you will learn other beneficial things. However, the process is what it is. For some people, a kind of goodbye might be useful, especially if or when the attachment is to another person. Preference and prejudice are important because they signal to you where you are in your attachment to the thought. Are you vehemently opposed or only moderately opposed? Do you support it wholeheartedly or only just a little bit? Or does it not matter to you either way at all? You will have a preferential or prejudicial reaction whenever you encounter the physical manifestation of a thought to which you are attached. You can use this information to learn from the thought, resolve it, and complete its life cycle with some skillful thinking on your part. When you complete that task, you will no longer be attached to the thought and you can see it for what it is. As the author, I wrote the above example with a bias for good, but it is possible that somebody has a preference for evil and a prejudice against good. That is, they are attached to evil. They are attached to the evil side of the good evil thought. The way in which they see these scenarios is different and entirely opposed to the way in which those attached to good see them. This difference of viewpoint is called perspective. It does not matter to which side of a thought one is attached. To them, the preferential side is good by nature of their attachment to it. Therefore, the side to which they are prejudiced is evil. To look at our example from the evil perspective, someone fighting priests may be trying to stop mind control and child abuse, which, given the information they have to work with, might be a good thing. They may not want to give to charity and perhaps may shun charity because they do not want to steal opportunities for growth from those in need. People usually try to do the right thing, but doing the right thing is contextual. It depends on the information one has at present and their position on the attachment to their thoughts. For any action one takes, somebody else can always find an opposite reaction that would also be right. This is not an argument for moral relativism, by the way. How one sees the world is dependent on their attachment to their thoughts, if any. A Christian does not see the world the same way as a Buddhist. They are attached to their Christianity. A conservative does not see the world the same way as a liberal, and vice versa. They are each attached to their politics, which happen to be completely opposed to each other. Conservatism and liberalism, being two opposing poles in every way, are different expressions in human thinking of the same thing. They are both part of one thought. The question is, what is that thought? Most thoughts are not binary, where there is only two extreme end values, such as true, false, or yes, no. Most thoughts are spectrums where one can attach to the center or at various positions out from the center in either direction. If people are attached to the passive side of a thought, those attached to the active side will appear completely backwards to them and doing it wrong. Whereas those who are attached to the passive side, like they are, get it. They may advance further and further into passivity as they progress in their thought. This is the dynamic of progression with respect to attachments. Progression is the advance in position from one point of attachment on the thought to another. It is not just merely a change in position, it is more like a slow, usually, advance in position over time. An individual or a population slowly change their ways as they acquire new information over time, and this is termed progression. To advance in the reverse direction is usually considered backwards. For example, in the last 100 years, Western society has become more and more liberal from what was once a very conservative position. This change in orientation has been termed progressive or social progressive. Any politician who would campaign against progressivism tended to lose. An error occurs when people think they can continue to be progressive, that progressivism can go on forever as though it were linear. It is not linear and it cannot go on forever. The thought will run it through its life cycle and switch polarities at the point of manifestation. Everyone attached to their political thought will then experience the opposite of what they were attached to and correspond to their degree of attachment. Where there were those who enforced love upon others, there will now no hatred. Those who thought diversity was a strength will face its weakness and learn from it. Those who would not stand up for themselves will now understand the importance of doing so. This reversal is known as the pendulum swinging the other way, but you may understand it as the ruling thought advancing in its life cycle. It can occur individually or en masse when a saturation point is reached in the population. Someone who attaches to the center will not learn anything. The thought will run through its life cycle and the polarity switch will be minimal, meaning there will be little knowledge to gain from the experience. The degree of knowledge that can be gained is proportional to the degree of attachment to either side of the thought. Typically, a center's position on the thought stays close to the center in such a way that the attachment is minimal. They will learn, but they will not learn much, and their growth will be slow. However, the chances of extreme events happening to them are also minimized. People typically choose centrist positions for stability, and this is often considered reasonable when they look at both sides of an issue. The further out you go in your attachment, the more extreme the position and the less people there are out there. Yet, this is still a good place to be for some people. This is often the place where heroic action occurs, such as with those who are eco warriors, pirates, or soldiers. This level of attachment often requires and develops skills in order to effectively wield it. Their actions will take them to a place where the thought can manifest with those of the opposite polarity. So, eco warriors will meet their targets, the pirates will meet their prey, and the soldiers will go to war. Some will succeed and some will fail, depending on when it is time for them to switch polarity. Some may even die. The same is true for those of the opposite polarity they meet, the targets, the prey, and the other soldiers. And then there is extremism. Extremism is an attachment to a thought as far from the center as possible in either direction. The attached is held firmly in the grip of the thought and often takes actions that are harmful to themselves and those around them. Remember, the attachment is a desire, an aim, and they are trying to satisfy it. There are few people willing to assist them at this level of attachment, so they must take unorthodox actions to meet their goal. We call both their actions and their goal extreme and the attached an extremist. Terrorists are not the only ones with extreme attachments. A fundamentalist is also extremist, and like the terrorists, they are sometimes also violent. A serial killer is another example of an extremist. Some heroes, most often in movies, are often extremist, for they too have to take unorthodox action to save their loved ones or their planet. Their goals are, of course, positive in this case. The attachment to their loved ones and their planet has to be extreme in order to motivate them to take the special kind of action, often involving infiltrating the enemy, with confidence and bravado that make an action movie fun. There are times when extreme action is necessary. It is possible that everyone around you could be attached to the extreme opposite side of the thought you are. When everyone in a population is attached to one side of a thought, this is a form of tyranny. They say that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and there is an intimate link between tyranny and terrorism. To the tyrants, the freedom fighter looks like a terrorist according to their thinking's perspective. To the freedom fighter or terrorist, the tyrants appear as irrational human beings from their perspective. There is much to gain from attaching to a more prominent position on the thought. Your view of the problem is more potent and your solutions more effective. But the blowback when you encounter the opposing polarity will also be stronger. It will be of equal degree to your attachment. If you do not run away from the blowback, you will have a lot of data to process, synthesize, and learn from. This is important because it allows you to grow faster. Do not fear your attachments to various ideas. You need those ideas to grow. But when the polarity switches and you experience the opposite side of your attachment, and you will know when this happens because you will be highly prejudiced against it, recognize that this is happening and learn from it. This will allow you to detach from the thought and use it as a tool in a detached way in your life. When you are detached from the thought, it no longer has any power over you, and you can use either side of it however you see fit, oftentimes wisely. When everyone is attached to the extreme end of one side of a thought, the thought will require a vehicle by which its balancing factor can manifest. That vehicle will be those who find themselves equal to the opposite side of the thought and of equal magnitude. Extremism must be matched by extremism for the balancing to occur properly. Then the survivors, having been shocked by the fallout, will detach from the thought and resolve to find a different way of being. This detachment is how they learn. As a population advances further and further into extremism, a kind of saturation point is reached where they cannot continue on their progression due to resistance. Those who are not attached to the extremism will begin to see a problem developing in their society, which they will try to fix by attaching to the opposite side of extremism. Over time, there will be more and more of those people until both sides have a significant force. Neither side can talk to each other because their perspectives are so foreign to each other and, in fact, exactly opposite each other. As well, neither side can detach from their extremism. The thought has them firmly in its grip. The thought is their God, and it will control their actions as it runs through its life cycle. At the point of manifestation, when the polarities reverse, there is war. Extreme attachments can be dangerous at another level too, to the one who is attached. It is possible for some people to become so attached to their idea that they lose themselves in the attachment. This is often the case with fundamentalist religious people who carry their strong attachment for decades. They tend to become mere shells of what they once were, where the only content of their being is the full embodiment of the thought. It infiltrates every action they take, and they cannot make a decision of their own volition. They never use their conscience, and they never take responsibility for themselves. They have lost their humanity, and they will die not knowing what it is. In general, your thoughts are not yours all the time, even though they seem like it. Your mind is more like a theater where certain thoughts come on stage if they are in the area rather than a thought factory that pumps out thoughts on a whim. Sometimes you do issue a thought and then it goes out and lives in the universe in the mental category, not physical. It is possible that you or somebody else could pick up that thought. Some thoughts have a way of aggregating in reality so that many people are influenced by their aim. Many people attach to the same thought. The more people that are attached to a thought, the bigger and more powerful it is. Take Christianity, for example. That is 2.2 billion people attached to the thought, and for 2,000 years, it has influenced the world in its particular way. As the thought progresses along its life cycle, it will affect the lives of those 2.2 billion people for better or for worse. It really all depends on where they attach to the thought. Thoughts are unconscious. They can only proceed according to their aim and affect those emotionally who are attached to them. Outside observers like ourselves can recognize the thought for what it is and make use of it how we see fit. It gets particularly interesting if you were the owner of a particular thought and birth a mobocracy. You could change a planet using tactics like that. Larger, more powerful thoughts try to keep themselves in existence by forcing people to attach to them. This behavior manifests in actions such as forcing people to adhere to a religion or the rule of law in a country. Corporate governance can also be by this behavior. The thought will live until every last attachment is released, until the religion, country, or corporation is destroyed. Particularly large thoughts are what people generally refer to when they refer to a god. Some Christians think of their god as an old man in the sky. This is an idea, a mythological representation or thought, and is divorced from the actual concept of God, which has a dual meaning of you and your universe, as well as the totality of all laws in the universe. You are very different from a typical thought. The old man in the sky is a symbol that represents the thought. The real concept that they are supposed to understand is something completely different. This is the danger of being attached to a thought for too long. It warps your understanding of reality. Within the spectrum of those who are attached to a mass thought, some will be centrist, some will be moderately attached, some will take risky action, and some will be extremely attached. The proportion will typically follow a bell curve, although it can shift to be more dominant on one side or the other. Recall our example of Jane, who was sitting on her couch watching a movie when she suddenly felt hungry. She desired to eat something to satiate her hunger and had to make a choice from among an apple, chips, or a steak. She chose the apple and took action to go to the kitchen, grab an apple, and return to the couch to continue watching the movie while enjoying that apple. This mundane example is very good at illustrating how it is that we make decisions. First, she feels hungry. A message from her stomach to her feeling part is telling her that her body's energy stores are getting low and it is time for her to refuel. This is what the feeling part is all about. It receives information from various sources in the form of feelings. To begin the process of fueling up, she must desire to eat something, with desire being the supplementary function of feeling. So, something communicates to feeling, and then feeling communicates to desire. You can track this yourself the next time you feel something. What do you automatically do when you encounter that feeling? You do something about it, do you not? That is desire. Now, Jane has a decision to make. Should she eat the apple, the chips, or the steak? This is what reason tries to work out, and it constitutes the bulk of our thinking work. Which option best satisfies her desire and which aligns with that she thinks is right? Reason communicates directly with rightness to help make this determination. The thinking operates in a cycle. Something will feel right or it will not. That is the voice of conscience, which is nothing more than a message from the part of us that knows right from wrong to the part of us that feels, so we can receive the information properly. This sequence of steps will repeat until a right action is found. This sequence, feeling, desire, reason, rightness, is called a thought process. It is the pattern that makes up your thinking before a decision is made. When a decision is made, it goes to your body's mind to take action with your body. Your identity and your personality are implicitly present at every step, so they are not a part of this diagram. The omission is purely for ease of understanding and not to say that they are not important. This process is how you work. It is the core operation of your conscious process of interacting with the universe. See something awful? Feeling. Want to know something about it? Desire. Figure out what that action should be? Reason. Recognize a particular action as the right action. Rightness or conscience. Smell a nice aroma. Feeling. Want a taste of that pie? Desire. Have enough money? Reason. Buy the pie slice? Rightness. Fail at math test? Feeling. Want to do better? Desire. Make a plan to do better? Reason. Develop study habits? Rightness. The thought process also works with the life cycle of a thought. Jane, first of all, had to know what she had available to eat. This knowledge that she had before the thinking took place is called a priori knowledge. It is the knowledge upon which she drew in order to start the thinking. Now she has to set a name for the thought that meets her desire to eat and satisfy her feeling and is ideally also right. This is primarily a mental activity, but when she decides to eat the apple, that is when the psychic category comes into play as she attaches herself to the idea of eating an apple. The thought will cycle through the process in her mind until she works out the details. Then the physical action takes place and the thought manifests. The thought process is used during both halves of the thought life cycle. During the first half, the thought process is about arriving at a decision for action. During the second half, it is about responding to that action and processing it for information. This is the time when the thought is balanced so that detachment and growth can occur. Jane feels satiated because she had something delicious to eat. There is no longer a desire to eat something, and in fact, she may even desire not to eat for a while. This and the feeling component are the opposite to her hunger initiative before. She can detach from the thought because it is no longer of any consequence to her. If she learns something new, such as if the particular kind of apple was delicious, she may add it to her store of knowledge and grow in that capacity. This new knowledge becomes a priori knowledge for the next time. There is one last area of Percival's work that I want to address for awareness's sake. This is the area of faculties. In the diagram, there are two new elements of note, and the labels have changed. I will first introduce the element in the center. In the center of the diagram is an open-ended Ouroboros-styled ring. This is the symbol we will use whenever we need to represent a consciousness. Right now, it represents your consciousness. This symbol has the following meanings when we use it, with further understandings can be found in Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning. Within the ring is all that you know. It is process knowledge or order. Outside the ring is all that you do not know. It is available knowledge but unexplored. It is chaos or the unknown. The ring itself represents your boundaries. The opening at the bottom represents your encounter with the unknown and ability to deal with uncertainty. The Ouroboros itself represents an infinite repeating cycle, which is your thought process and life cycle. Your consciousness acts as a process that transforms unknown knowledge into known knowledge, and the open ended Ouroboros accurately depicts that. The small white rectangles with dotted borders along each of the parts represent interfaces, or the faculties we are discussing. The faculties are interfaces between you, your consciousness denoted by the Ouroboros, and the respective part. In system science, an interface is a component that transfers inputs and outputs across boundaries. Interfaces relay messages and have within them the ability to transform the message from form to form as it crosses the boundary. Each of your parts works in a certain way. We do not know how they work necessarily, just that they work, but we can work with them, knowing that system science accurately describes the principles by which they work. I will first introduce the faculties and then explain the concept further. The light faculty sheds light on the contents of the categories. Light is Percival's word for that which makes things visible or conscious to you. When we discussed observing the law or the parts of our being, we are using the light faculty. It is when we witness or observe or become conscious of a particular thing. It is attached to the identity part because it is you who is becoming conscious. The time faculty regulates and measures the changes of units or bodies in their relations to each other. It manages changes in the relations between multiple entities. This is not the same concept of time as we use in our calendars. It has been said that time is really just a change in matter from one state to another, and Percival is saying that it also has a relationship component between those matters. If you sense an awareness of the passage of time, that is this faculty. You are aware that matter around you is moving and changing, perhaps ever so slightly. The time faculty is attached to your rightness part, although I cannot explain why. The image faculty gives form to matter. This faculty is commonly known as your imagination. In your mind, you create an image of something you want to make. That is the form stage of the thought life cycle, and the next stage being that you actually make it according to the form specified in your imagination. The image faculty is attached to your feeling part because it can help to form and guide your feeling area as needed. This seems to be the basis for a lot of occult workings and requires extensive training to begin to work correctly. The focus faculty is your attention. You may have noticed that you can only really have your attention on one thing at a time. This is the focus faculty in action. It centers your attention on the subject of your aim, and remember, aim from your thought process. The focus faculty is attached to your body mind, your objective mind, the mind you normally think with every day. Focus is the root of all thinking. The dark faculty serves to modify the other faculties. It can have an augmenting capability or a diminishing capability. Because it is attached to the desire part, I can only assume willpower has something to do with it. Motive faculty gives purpose and direction to the thought. This is your aim. It is attached to your reasoning part to help work this out. The I am faculty accesses your real self. People commonly identify with their ego, or with a false sense of self. This faculty is about working with, but not identifying with, your real self. It is attached, of course, to your self part for expression. Although it may seem like the faculties are independent, they all actually work together. The most important faculty to work with or master is the focus faculty. When using the focus faculty, or focusing for short, it will pull in the other faculties if it goes on long enough. Focus will trigger your imagination to get a better picture of what is being focused. Both will enhance their activities further if willpower is strong via the dark faculty, which will be further enhanced by your reasoning or motive. The primary measurement for good focusing is time, the time faculty, with a longer focus being more potent and constructive. You will witness, observe, and engage your real self in the focus action, like you do with all actions. Real thinking is about focusing well and bringing all these faculties to bear on the subject at hand and in alignment with the thought process, thought life cycle, and without attachment. The understanding of faculties as interfaces is important because it makes conscious that you have to somehow go through something to access a part. It makes conscious that those parts behave in certain standard ways. These parts can be abstracted away and even replaced. Consider your physical body, which is only one part of the whole diagram. If we replace the body with a different body, as in you die and reincarnate, the rest of the diagram is still kept intact and you can work with the new body just as effectively because it shares the same interface, your focus of attention. Perhaps the other parts can also be swapped out, although I do not know for certain. What I do know is that your parts are not you. You are you, as in the individuated whole, and there are sections of you that behave in certain ways, which we have termed parts and faculties. Faculties make it clear that there is more to this model than I can draw. Returning back to our model, there are a number of analyses we can do to learn more about how it works. We can group the parts in each category to form a trinity. We can divide the parts horizontally by category and vertically by energy. And we can line up each part to the mind to uncover a strength effect that diminishes with distance. Each pair of parts in each category is opposed to each other and is technically a thought. That is, they follow the structure of a thought. Feeling and desire together are part of one thing, with feeling being passive and desire being active. We cannot desire something without also having a feeling about it. And a feeling will always want some desire to be met to satiate it. Feeling and desire together are the same thing, which we call the doer. Rightness and reason together are also part of one thing, but in a different category. Rightness is passive and reason is active. When rightness is in play, we use reason to validate it or justify it. Reason can be used, rightly or wrongly, to justify our actions or validate our choices. We call this part of us the thinker. Our identity and self parts are also part of one thing, with identity being passive and self being active. The two cannot function independently of each other. We cannot express ourselves via self if we have no identity to express. Nor is there a point to having an identity if we cannot express and explore it. This part of our being, which anchors our consciousness and stores our knowledge, is called the knower. The knower, thinker, and doer are merely groupings of our parts in each category. This grouping can be made because each pair of parts is interrelated to each other, opposed to each other, and part of the same thing. They each are pairs of opposites which form a specialized thought. Yet, this is all part of one whole being. These primary parts of the knower, thinker, and doer are just categorizations of major sections of our being or consciousness. The knower, thinker, and doer form a trinity. They are one being, you divided into three parts through our categorization. This is the same concept as the Trinity discussed in the Bible. The Father corresponds to the knower, that all knowing part of your being that stores your knowledge and anchors your identity. The Holy Spirit corresponds to the thinker, your conscience, your source of rightness and reasoning ability. It is also known as the Spirit of truth, and because rightness is its ability, you can now see why. The Son corresponds to the doer. This is the only part of the three that actually incarnates in the body. You feel your body and things that happen to it. You desire things for the body, typically material things of nature, although desire can move beyond nature. The doer portion of your being actually takes up more space in the body than it probably should, and does not leave much room for the thinker or knower, and so their contact is often remote and weak. This explains the belief that, quote, God sent his one and only Son. The only part of that could incarnate did so, but this is a tragedy. All of you should be able to incarnate at once in a single body. Human bodies on this planet are not developed enough to support that kind of incarnation, unfortunately. When all parts of you are incarnate in the body and working in harmony, you are said to be in alignment. Another analysis we can do is to separate our model into different sections, both vertically and horizontally. The vertical separation helps us to understand the kind of energies at work in our being. These are commonly understood as masculine energy and feminine energy. The left side of the diagram, with the parts identity, rightness, and feeling, is the feminine energy side. This is so because these are passive functions of our being. Identity is just there to identify us. Rightness does not do anything unless it is queried by reason. Feeling receives messages as feelings but does not act on them. Feminine energy is typically associated with parallel thinking, intuition, and creativity. The right side of the diagram, with the parts self, reason, and desire, is the masculine energy side. These are the active functions of our being. Self expression via personality is a kind of action. Reasoning is work, mental work. Desire fuels passion and will and leads to bodily action. Masculine energy is typically associated with power, logic, and action. The balance of these energies is what informs mental gender. Women are typically dominant on the feeling side, and men are typically dominant on the desire side. This is not always the case, although it is typical. The horizontal separation helps us understand the layers of our being. These layers are the noetic, mental, and psychic, in line with our categories. The noetic layer contains the parts identity and self. It is our knower, as described earlier. The mental layer contains the parts reason and rightness, and is our thinker. The psychic layer contains the parts feeling and desire, and is our doer, as described before. These layers are stacked one on top of the other. Lower layers cannot function well without the upper layers, and upper layers cannot do anything without the lower layers. A properly functioning human has all layers available to them. It is possible to cut off access to certain layers. I just want you to be aware that we can compartmentalize them as such. None of your parts work in isolation, and you are not merely the sum of your parts. You are an intelligence or a complete consciousness that is at a certain stage of growth on its developmental path. We are all different insofar as our personalities, our expressions, our life experiences, our accumulated knowledge, how we think, and how we feel, but these are more related to our capacity for development. Structurally, even at the subjective consciousness level, we all have the same parts and work in the same way. As a conscious intelligence, we work with all of these parts at the same time instantaneously. This is why it can be such a challenge to become aware of their function or even that we even have them. They are not us, but at the same time, they are us. Each of our parts communicates with us, and we with each of our parts all the time. The strength of that communication rests in how attuned we are to each part, or said another way, how much we are in tune with ourselves. It is possible for us to lose contact with certain parts. It is possible for us to lose contact with entire categories of our being. In the diagram, the center area has been shaded to varying degrees, connects each part, and focuses upon the mind. You manifest the part's functionality in your body via your mind whenever you act. Your mind also works with them when thinking things through via the thought process. There are three channels, noetic, mental, and psychic, with the psychic channel contained in the mental channel and the mental channel contained in the noetic channel. This captures that how you feel about something is limited to how you think about it, which in turn is limited to what you know about it. The strength of the channels vary. Shown above is a wide channel, but for most people, the channels are very narrow. The strength of a channel is also indicated by its transparency, with darker channels being stronger. A spotlight metaphor aptly describes how communication channels work. Imagine a narrow beam of spotlight focused upon a point. You can see clearly that it is brightest in the center and fades out the further away you get. If you increase the strength of the spotlight, there is more light focused around the center and it covers more area. This increases its intensity, potency, or power. If you adjust its field of view, the area affected by the spotlight is increased. There is a bigger, although dimmer, center, and the further out areas are more easily seen as rings. This spotlight analogy is a lot like how consciousness channels itself through the different categories. In Percival's work, he actually describes the categories as atmospheres, and so it is as though there is a beam of light shining through the clouds. A part of your being is contained in each category. The categories are like layers arranged from top to bottom. The closer the layer to your body, the stronger the communication. There are two adjustable properties to this communication: its strength and its breadth. The breadth represents how much of that communication channel you are able to process. For example, how in tune with your feelings are you? How well do you know your desires? How much of you are in alignment with your conscience? How well are you able to reason and think things through? How well do you know yourself? How well do you express yourself? How well do you know the universe in which you are part and are able to access that knowledge? These kinds of questions indicate breadth of the communication channel. The strength property of a communication channel indicates intensity or power or how strongly it is coming through. If you have experienced any kind of brain fog, this is an example of a very weak channel, to use the atmosphere analogy again, which, like a radio, can cause noise and interference and error in the reception. It is possible to have a very strong channel. You might see this in spurts of inspiration or intuition, or supreme acts of beauty or movement or skill. At the current time on Earth, such strong channels are rare and only present in particularly skilled individuals, and even then, perhaps only temporarily. It is more common for communication channels to have average strength. It is through these communication channels that your consciousness communicates with the various parts of your being. It is through these communication channels that you are able to think well. Presented here is the full model of ourselves that we have been working towards. You can arrive at the categories and the parts by following the map we showed earlier. Then, by the work done here, we have the relations of everything to each other displayed with arrows and via statements. The thought life cycle is the sequence: identity, rightness, feeling, mind, desire, reason, self. It has an exception at desire to mind, which is known as history repeats. The thought process is the sequence: feeling, desire, reason, rightness. It is important that this not be disrupted, for it hinders adaptation and growth. Your conscience is the message from rightness to feeling. Your realizer is your ability to make realizations on topics and is the willful action of desire to reason. Your knower is your noetic parts, identity and self. Your thinker is your mental parts, rightness and reason. Your doer is your psychic parts, feeling and desire. The knower, thinker, and doer are three parts of one being, a trinity, you. Your parts are accessed via their faculties, marked with via statements, which have their own specific function. All of this ultimately goes through your body via your mind to help you grow through your actions in the physical world. Your mind operates by focus and pulls in all the other faculties and parts when it needs something done. You are identified by your boundary from the rest of consciousness, and it is your duty to protect it, which you do by employing self respect.